Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we are again moving forward with our early off-season preview series, asking a handful of questions for each of the teams in the league here, as we are getting pretty much right on the cusp of free agency. So, we are going to move things right along here. Going to be talking about the Philadelphia 76ers, a team that recently had quite a bit of news dropped on top of them. News that was so big that I actually had to re-record this video because of the news that dropped. That news being that James Harden is opting into his player option, but doing so for the purposes of being traded by the 76ers to go somewhere else. So, obviously, one of the biggest names in the league will presumably be on the move. We're just not sure where, but presumably he will not be in Philly for much longer. But even with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the stats here for the 76ers from the previous campaign. They ended the regular season with a 54-28 record. That got them the third seed in the Eastern Conference, second seed in the Atlantic Division behind the Celtics. And, well, speaking of the Celtics, that is kind of where the 76ers playoff road ended. They ended their run with a 7-4 record overall. Pretty good from the sort of higher level, maybe macro view of it, but they were eliminated in round two. They were not able to make their way to the conference finals. So, not quite as far as they wanted to go, but still a pretty impressive run. But we move now to some of the other statistics for Philly. By offensive rating, they were one of the elite teams in the NBA, fourth overall in offense. Their defense, not quite at that level, but still very impressive in the top 10 at eighth overall, which put the team's net rating in third, while playing with the 27th highest pace and the 11th highest payroll. So it's a pretty impressive season by just about every metric here for the 76ers, except for the fact that they wanted to be deeper into the playoff picture. They wanted the conference finals. They wanted a shot at a title, and obviously that does not come together for them. So unfortunate, but now we'll take a look at some of the additions and losses here for this team because it is a little bit significant. We will start with the additions section, although that is certainly the part that attracts a little bit less attention, but we still got to get through it here. In terms of additions, Daniel House Jr. was added to this lineup. He, re-added to the lineup, I should say. He did accept his player option, so he will be returning. In the losses column, we have Montrezl Harrell, who declined his player option, and of course now James Harden, who again did accept the player option, but is going to be traded. So he will be in the losses column very, very soon. Of course, that does mean that presumably there would be players added to the additions section as well once the trade completes, but for right now, we don't know what that trade is potentially going to look like. So those sections will obviously be left alone for the time being. But that gets us into our questions here for Philly. We start with the obvious one. What does this team do now without James Harden? So, as we just outlined, Harden is reportedly opting into his player option in order to be traded away from the 76ers. And the question now will be, what does the team get back for him and where do they go from there? While Harden's scoring workload definitely fell compared to previous seasons and previous teams, he pretty handily led the 76ers in assists. He had an average of 10.7 per game in the regular season, which was not just the highest on the Sixers. It actually was, I believe, the highest average in the league. So, yeah, his scoring definitely sort of dipped off, but only because he was focusing so heavily on kind of improving his stats in the assist column and being that facilitator for the 76ers. Of course, there's really no getting around this part, so we will get to it. His performance in the playoffs ended up being a little bit up and down. There were games where he almost single-handedly carried the 76ers to a win, and there were other games where he may as well not have had a jersey on because he effectively disappeared. And unfortunately, that's a trend that sort of plagued him at multiple points in his playoff career. But at this point, I mean, he hasn't been able to get rid of that reputation. And if you're the 76ers, it's not going to be your problem for much longer if he is being traded. But the opposite end of that thought process is, well, who do you now get that's going to do an equal or better job in terms of fitting into your team than James Harden did? Now, I will say in terms of maybe the internal option here for them, Tyrese Maxey certainly has come on strong as an option for this team in terms of his offensive potential, but we haven't really seen him serve as much of a playmaker, really haven't seen him put into that, quote unquote, true point guard position in his 3 years so far. He's handled the ball occasionally, but he's still kind of a offensively oriented, shoot first kind of guy. We have not seen him make the kind of transition that James Harden did recently, where he starts racking up the assist count. But if they don't want to really put Tyrese Maxey into that role, because honestly, he does pretty damn well in the role he's currently got, then the answer to this question may come from whatever the potential package for Harden contains. It's possible that the 76ers look for a trade partner, if they don't already have one figured out, that can specifically give them a starting point guard caliber player as a part of the deal. And sure, maybe he's not quite to the level and experience as James Harden, but it's a plug and play kind of guy that you could just put right in your starting point guard position, who can run the offense and really just kind of feed the ball into Joel Embiid multiple times per game. So who knows? They could go with Maxey. They could look to get something back in the upcoming Harden deal that sort of solves this problem for them. But speaking of Tyrese Maxey, that brings us to point number 2, and that point is Tyrese Maxey a part of this team's long-term plan? I know this is maybe the 4th or 5th time we've asked this kind of question for a team, whether X player will be with them long-term, but that's exactly what this point in the offseason is for. This is where teams evaluate, is this a guy that we want to extend? Is this a guy we want to re-sign? Do we see him genuinely being a part of our team beyond just the last season that they played? And that's now the position that Tyrese Maxey has worked himself into. The 76ers picked up his team option last season, so they have him for one more season this season. And he's only going to be paid $4.3 million. So it is an insanely cheap deal for the production that he's currently giving them. But what happens beyond that point, right? This last season, Maxey averaged just over 20 points per game. He shot 48% from the field, including 43% from 3. And he had an assist-to-turnover ratio of just under 3. Of course, part of the reason that that ratio is high is because both the turnovers and the assist count were fairly low, but whatever. It's still a pretty impressive ratio. But all in all, Maxey has contributed in a pretty major way and remained relatively efficient doing so, although we haven't gotten to see too much of him as just a pure playmaker, obviously, because Harden was kind of holding that position and running the offense most of the time for this team. But I think Maxey is definitely a benefit. He's a player who has also been able to, for the most part, hold his own in the playoffs as well, despite being a relatively young guy. So, that being said, do the 76ers look to extend him? And if they do, what will that cost be? The likes of Joel Embiid and Tobias Harris are already making a pretty substantial amount of money. The James Harden trade could free up some of their finances, depending on how it goes. If they trade Harden just about straight up for another sort of star player, then the exchange of money is probably going to be equal. And in that case, the 76ers are kind of just as hard up on cap space as they already are. If Harden gets traded for multiple smaller pieces, then maybe some of those pieces are on expiring deals. Some of them could be let go and some money could be freed up to look to Tyrese Maxey's long-term future that way. So the 76ers may have to do a little bit of financial uh, jumping through hoops here, but I think it may be worth it for them to extend Maxey. And of course, all of this will really depend on what exactly the return is for that Harden trade. But with that being said, we move on to a third point, a point that changed just a little bit here, obviously, with the Harden news. The third point is it time for the 76ers to move on from Tobias Harris? Now, Harris will be entering the final year of his contract for this upcoming season and is set to make a pretty substantial $39.2 million. In fact, in this last season, he was making more money than either Harden or Embiid. The problem is he wasn't really producing like it. Now, obviously, with Harden, Embiid, and even Tyrese Maxey on the floor, Harris falls into that sort of third or fourth option on offense. And even if you're taking it from that perspective, his numbers are kind of rough. He averaged 14.7 points per game. That is his lowest average since the 2015-2016 season. He averaged just 5.7 rebounds. That is his lowest since 2017-2018. And those numbers would not be that bad if Harris were being paid like the fourth or fifth option on a team, right? Because then the production would be in line with his pay. But instead, he's making just south of $40 million. So the cost is pretty high there for the numbers that you're getting. It's also worth noting that outside of Embiid, no one on the 76ers could really consistently rebound. The 76ers were 26th in the league on the rebounding front. So scoring and rebounding and defense were kind of supposed to be the cornerstones of Harris's game. And on two of those three fronts, he's not really producing. His scoring is down, his rebounds are down. He's still playing solid defense, but the defense alone is not really worth nearly $40 million for him. He's just not producing in all the categories that they kind of needed him to. And he's being paid a lot of money, right? And the 76ers may have some financial considerations in the future where maybe they look at his contract and decide they don't want to be on the hook for that kind of money. We talked about this with Maxey as well, right? You might be looking at an extension or at re-signing him to a long-term deal, and there's still the uncertainty of what comes back from the James Harden trade, whether that saves you any money or not. So maybe they look to move Harris, right? He's on the hook for $39.2 million. That is a lot of money, but it is an expiring contract. This is the final year of his deal, and honestly, he still has some production in him. We talked about his numbers being kind of the lowest that they've been in a couple of years, but that's still close to 15 points a game and 5 or 6 rebounds a game. There are still some teams in the league that would be willing to eat that big contract for 1 year and make the most of whatever level of production Harris gives them, just so that that number sort of comes off their books later. Or honestly, they could try to extend him for less if they wanted to. So if they can do that, if they opt to move him, well, then you need to replace him, right? Tobias Harris may not have been playing fantastically, may not have been producing well, but he was still playing substantial minutes. He was still playing relatively good defense. So who do you get or have on the roster to replace him? Honestly, I think that they could maybe roll the dice with some of the younger guys that they have, give more minutes to the likes of Paul Reed, Georges Niang, Jalen McDaniels maybe could even play down a position. So those guys could get a little bit more time spread out amongst 2 or 3 of them and maybe collectively fill the void that Tobias Harris would leave if you were to move him. That is definitely risky because there's no guaranteeing that any of those 3 players, let alone all 3 of them, are ready for that sort of significant increase in their role. But it's risky, but it's not $40 million risky, if that makes sense. If it doesn't work, well, you didn't have to pay a crazy amount of money to try. So that would be the argument there. Of course, like I said, this all rides on what happens in the Harden trade. It could be that they get a lot of small pieces that free them up a little bit financially, and then having Harris being paid $39.2 million in his final season isn't really a concern for them at all. But there's a lot of uncertainty that has now been thrown into the mix with the James Harden situation. Honestly, it was going to be uncertain even before we knew there was going to be a trade, because prior to that, we thought the 76ers were going to try to give him a contract offer that also would have strained their financial situation. So it's now maybe not more complicated, but complicated in a different manner than we had initially suspected. But either way, the 76ers have some decisions to make, but it all has to be on the back burner until the James Harden trade is completed. That has to be priority one here for the team. So with that in mind, that will do it for the 76ers. Please feel free to share your thoughts with me. What do you think about the long-term futures of both Tyrese Maxey and Tobias Harris with this team? Where do you think James Harden goes? What do you think the 76ers will get back for him? And how will that affect what this team looks like moving forward? But again, feel free to let me know your thoughts. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.